Welcome back, guys. Thanks for being with us today. Fantastic event and some great talks so far. And we really appreciate all the donations to the GoFundMe page. We've gone past £7,000. We're well past that, which is phenomenal. Yeah, fantastic talks, but we've got one more to go. Last but by no means least, James Bohr. So over to you, James.
Thank you. I'm going to be talking about some techniques which I've swiped from medical research and can be very useful with cybersecurity. So the obligatory a bit about me, I'm a security consultant. I've got Twitter, LinkedIn and email, as most people do, and I get tired a lot. There we go. Right, figures of merit. Figures of merit are part of what we're going to be talking about, but this is just a quick overview of them. Figures of merit are simply numbers that rate something. The same way you would do scoring in an RFP, that's all it is. It's a way to get a single number to rate a system or a solution and give you an idea of what it is. Sometimes you might have 2 or 3, sometimes it is boiled down to 1. Scoring in RFPs usually goes across anything between 4 to 20, and when you're checking the technical ability of a solution, you probably get 1 out of it at the end, you know, a star ranking of yes, this is good, or no, this is bad. And frankly, that's not particularly useful, because a good figure of merit should tell you whether the solution is appropriate, not just whether it's generally good. So we'll be looking at a way to get FOMs for almost any solution you want to. And this is where the matrix of confusion, or confusion matrices, which some people do get confused about, come in. But first, some background. Security testing life cycle, you may have a different view on this. That's fine. This is just the one that I'm working to for the purposes of this presentation. So it will be quick, I do promise. We have definition. Yes, we want to do this. What is it we want to do? Okay. Design. How do we want to do it? Development. Let's actually start putting it together, doing the coding. Deployment. Let's lift and shift it into a live environment. And monitoring and maintenance. Let's keep an eye on it in that live environment to make sure it doesn't go horribly wrong. Really nice and simple. And each one of those cycles has part of the Denning cycle in it. Let me just lean out of the way of check. So plan, do, check, act, which hopefully everyone's fairly familiar with. Plan is, what are we going to do? Do is, do it. Check is, well, did what we did meet our plan? Did it hit what we wanted it to hit? And act is, anything that didn't work, fix it, work out what to do on the next planning stage, and standardize anything that did work. Again, very simple. I'm not doing a talk on project management here. So hopefully everyone's comfortable with those. Let me know if you want to go into them more, and I'll introduce you to a Prince2 guy. But otherwise, we'll get onto the actual meat of this, which is the matrices of confusion, which sound pretty cool and really are. Truth, beauty, and tests. The first thing we need to use a confusion matrix is to establish our ground truth. Now, our ground truth can be almost anything. We don't expect to get the grand ultimate truth of how the universe works. Since we're looking at it from a security point of view, we'll ignore the philosophy. We will dictate that what we say is true for the purposes of our measurement is true. It's absolutely true. It's unquestionable. If we have cause to question it, we have to start over. So rather than saying, well, we want to test against every single possible vulnerability, which isn't useful, we would take a sample of what is true. And this is the same thing in medical testing. It's a sample of the population, and that sample will vary, and you'll be more accurate with it depending on the stage in diagnosis that you've reached. So we have a sample of the truth that we say is absolutely fundamentally true, and we will not question it while we're testing. And we know what our tests will do. They will say a vulnerability does or does not exist. If it exists, yes, it's there. And if it doesn't exist, no, it's not. Problem is that our tests don't necessarily match to the truth. So where our tests say that there's a vulnerability, we'll call that a positive. And anything that's not positive and isn't within our sample, we will just discard. We can say it's a negative, and if it's a negative that we've taken as part of our sample for a defined system, then that's fine. We can keep it as a negative. If it's not in our sample, we ignore it completely from the scoring. And where our test gives us a positive, and we know that there is a genuine vulnerability or a genuine incident in progress because we've designed this system as a test for a security solution, whether that's a vulnerability scanner, whether it's a patch detection solution, whether it's for a pen testing company, because you could absolutely use this method to get a good assessment of pen testing companies. Whatever it is, where the test gives us the same result as reality, what we know is already there, that's great, and we call that a true positive or negative. And where it doesn't, that's a false positive or negative. So just for a quick summary on this, which will hopefully work, I have here a load of tests, and let's say that the green ones are genuine things I already know are actually there. The red ones are false positives that have been picked up by my test. And this is where the matrix bit comes in. So actual positives sit over here, and actual negatives sit over there. Great. But that doesn't tell me how my test performed. For that, we get the matrix. And there we have, say, and I've just realized I've got the colors wrong. It's quite difficult doing it on a screen, but we've got 2 true positives. We've got 2 true negatives. We've got 3 false positives, and we've got 3 false negatives. The false negatives are generally not a good thing. False positives generate work, but how important they are, how bad they are for our figure of merit for whichever solution we're looking at, depends where we are in the life cycle. So hopefully this has made some sense to you, and we'll get into how numbers are generated. But the important bit is the test will tell us positive or negative. The test will tell us positive or negative for a particular finding. We won't know if that test is giving us the truth unless we've already established it. So true and tested positive, true positive but tested negative, true negatives, and false positives. And back to the slides. Go. Okay, so yes, not confusing at all, despite being the matrices of confusion or confusion matrix. Take your pick on which one. You will either have a positive or negative test result for something that is or is not truly positive or negative. And that is less confusing than it sounds, but only once you've actually got the hang of it. This does confuse clinicians as well. I have that on very good authority. So to do some examples, we have a test of a positive where a vulnerability scanner, let's say, or a pen test said there was a potential SQL injection on our site. We know because we set the site up and we are using it as an assessment that yes, there was SQL injection on this site. So lovely, we've got a true positive. Let's go for a pen test again. And this time the pen testers are telling us that there's potential cross-site scripting. Well, because of the way that it's built, we know that this is not actually an exploitable finding on this particular environment. So that would be a false positive. Another example, there's a exploitable vulnerability, which our vulnerability scanning software did not pick up. It didn't pick up that we're still running Java 3, as an example. Well, clearly, false negative, don't really want that. And finally, true negative, that's anything that the test didn't find and isn't there. And again, it's not that useful for us because there's too many potential vulnerabilities. But if we've taken a clear sample, we've defined it, then we can use those true negatives. Right, that's a confusion matrix, or the start of one. We ignore the uncertainty and say we know what the truth is. We're lying, but it's good enough for maths. And we say that our test sample is absolutely representative and accurate and cannot be questioned while we're using it for assessment. So there's some numbers that we can get out of these matrices, and these are the bits where it becomes useful to us. The first one is accuracy, and all that is we take the true positives and true negatives and divide them by all positives and all negatives. And all that tells us is how many times the test has been right and how many times it's been wrong. It's a good general measure. It would be lovely if vulnerability scanners did this against, say, a standard list of 100 vulnerabilities for a particular test system. No one does it yet, but it is potentially possible. But it's not actually that useful a number because, yes, it tells us it's accurate. It doesn't tell us how useful it is at a particular stage in the life cycle. So moving on, we have the error rate. That's really just the opposite of the accuracy. It's where we know it's been wrong. Again, not incredibly useful for us. It's a very generic figure of merit. It does have its place, but we really want to be looking a bit beyond it. You could, however, use it to test or to assess similar systems, the same way you could with accuracy. If you've got two vulnerability scanners, for example, that you're looking at with the same life cycle stage, test them both, get the accuracy and error rate for both, and it will give you an idea. Much more usefully, we have the true positive rate. Now, medical science, this is seen as sensitivity or the recall rate or the hit rate, and there is no standardized terminology. You will find all sorts of other terms being used, but true positive rate is quite accurate. That is the number of true positives over true positives and false negatives. So from a security point of view, what this gives us is a measure of residual risk after we've acted on every finding from a test. So we ignore the false positives, we ignore the extra work that false positives will generate. What it does tell us is what's left over. How likely is it that we've missed something, and what percentage will we have missed? So the residual risk in the system can be predicted to a degree by looking at the true positive rate. And we will come back to this. True negative rate, almost exactly the same thing. But we have two options, and this goes back to not being able to pick up negatives easily. Because our potential negatives are everything that isn't present in our system, if we're not defining a set sample of, say, 100 vulnerabilities, 40 of which we know aren't present and are counting as true negatives, then we can ignore this completely. If we are taking that sample where we've got negatives included in our truth, so we can measure against them, this becomes potentially useful. But what it's telling us is how good it is at telling us what work we do not need to do. And that does become important. And we have a couple more measures. We have the positive predictive value, which is true positives over true positives and false positives. And this will tell us how useful it is. This is the precision. This is how many of the positive findings are actually useful to us. how many of them let us solve something, and how many of them, if we act on all of them, generate wasted effort. And the true negative, or negative predictive value, which doesn't really have any other names that I've been able to find because people don't really use it. It's potentially a useful measure again, but negatives aren't of as much interest to us most of the time because they're telling us work we don't need to do. However, if you had a system which had a perfect true negative predicted value, so NPV of 1, you would be able to say that anything the system does not find, you can ignore. If you find a system like that, whether it's a vulnerability scanner, a pen testing company, a threat modeling approach, anything, please tell me about it, because I've yet to find one, mainly because that would be a perfect system. Okay. So, going back to our life cycle, at different life cycle stages, different things matter. And this is again tying into the medical approach. So when remediation is expensive, when it's difficult to carry out remediation, when it will generate a lot of work, cost a lot of effort, we really care about false positives. We want to have as few of those as possible. If your false positive is going to lead to 48 hours of downtime for a system running through millions of pounds a day, you don't want a false positive in any circumstances. So remediation costs mean that we care about false positives a lot more. When remediation costs are cheap, we don't care about false positives. What we care about are false negatives. We don't want to miss something when it's easy to fix, because if we can fix it when it's easy, we don't have to deal with it at a point it's expensive. So again, going back to the life cycle, and you may be able to tell that remediation costs, of course, go up as you get further in the life cycle until you've deployed a system, and remediating it becomes incredibly expensive because you have to go all the way back to planning. Whereas false negatives, if we could pick those up at the definition stage, fantastic. We don't care if we get false positives there. But if we can eliminate or reduce the false negatives, that's great. We can fix them really easily because we just change the requirements to include those security requirements. Now, the next step is when determining the actual ground truth is difficult, we have to care less about the truth because it's so much more work to do it. And this again ties into the life cycle. At the definition stage, we can't tell whether a particular issue is going to lead to further issues down the line. We've got a lot more uncertainty. So our ground truth, we can be much broader with, make a much wider sample, and we don't care so much about the accuracy of what's true. We want to err on the side of caution. Of course, once the system's actually deployed, it's relatively easy to determine ground truth. For any particular vulnerability, we can use a proof of concept and show whether it can be exploited or not. And then we really do want to care about the truth. So there is a trade-off. Now, quick example that I threw together. These are hypothetical numbers. But let's say we're doing a vulnerability scan. We have a sample of standard vulnerabilities which we know are present in the system. Anything that the scan detects which aren't in that list are obviously negatives. And we go through and we verify all of the positives, so we know which are true positives. So that's how we develop our sample. That's how we establish the truth. Sample systems will vary at each stage in the life cycle, but the calculation of the figures of merit is the same at every stage. So here we go. We've calculated our positive predictive value. So it's 0.62. Whether that's good or bad is hard to say. We've got nothing to compare it against. We've got our true positive rate, which is 0.82. Again, hard to say if that's good or bad. Nothing to compare it against. True negative rate is 0. We've not got any true negatives because anything that wasn't found by the test and wasn't in our sample is by default a true negative. If you've got somewhere you've included a sample because you can, that's a different matter. Now, how this actually ties into the life cycle stages. So, at the definition stage, when we're defining the requirements for software, we know that the remediation costs are incredibly low, or ideally they should be. If your remediation costs are expensive at definition, there is something fundamentally wrong with how you are doing projects. Your remediation costs when you're defining the project are low. So that's when you want to do a quick, very, very sensitive test. So you don't care about false positives being picked up, but you want to eliminate any false negatives going through. However, identifying true positives at this stage is expensive. So you want your sample to be extremely broad. Rather than saying SQL injection on a particular text field on the site, you might just say code injection. And then you apply some general principles as remediation. In medical testing, this would be somewhere before even the initial screening. This would be when you're perhaps having a quick chat with the surgery nurse and asking for some general health advice, or popping into the pharmacy. I've got a bit of headache, or I'm feeling a bit slow. What do you recommend? Well, eat healthy, drink plenty of water, exercise, general good practices. Those are the remediations at this point, because we're not saying anything is seriously wrong, and applying good hygiene and good practices will help us to prevent bigger problems further on. So, definition, we want highest possible sensitivity. We want to pick up all of the false negatives, and we don't care if we pick up the false positives, because that just means we expand the requirements so that they include more security. And I've yet to see someone argue that more security done cheaply is a bad thing, or cheaply and effectively without introducing blocks, but that's a different argument. Then we have the design stage. Remediation costs are still low. This is at your architecture planning, for example. And yeah, taking the right approach. So high sensitivity again. Identifying true positives is expensive. It's less expensive than at the definition stage, because you will be saying, this is the technology we're using, this is the approach that we'll be taking, but it's a bit broader, or it's easier to be accurate. You know that you're going to use a particular software version. You know that you're going to build on AWS. You know that you're going to build on Azure. You know that you're going to use Docker, Java, whatever you're using, you've probably selected. So theoretically, you've got an idea of what the threats are to that system. And this is where your threat modeling can go a bit more granular, but you're not really getting into the testing. This is going on from the quick chat with the pharmacist and more to, I'm going to get a personal trainer, I'm going to tell them what my goals are, they can walk me through it, they can give me more accurate life cycle or exercise advice, target muscle groups that are appropriate, because they're an expert in that. And this stage is very much expert driven for the test. There isn't really a technical solution we could deploy for this. A vulnerability scanner will do nothing for most architectural diagrams. There are threat modeling solutions which will help, but even there, it does come down to the expertise in your design team. So we are still pre-GP checkup, if you want to take a medical view of it. Then we move on to development. Now, this is the point where you can start talking to your GP. You're starting to put things together. You've got code going in. You can do DAST. You can do SAST, and you can measure the effectiveness of those tools. You can say how many false positives a particular tool picks up. You might have an idea of how many false negatives, depending on what other assessments you do. So if you're running 5 different tools for a proof of concept, you might get one of them pulling out true positives, which the other doesn't pull out at all. They can then go into your truth as false negatives. So you have got an idea there of what your false negatives are. The problem is your remediation costs have gone up a bit here, because remediating anything that you find involves taking a step back in the process or adding it to the backlog. It involves extra effort. It could be a delay, it could be extra expense, it could be almost anything, but it is harder to do at this stage than at the design stage. So here we want to detect fewer false positives. False positives now have a burden. They apply friction to our project. Whereas earlier, false positives weren't an issue at all. So here we care more about false positives. False negatives are still a standard issue. They might be picked up later, but it would be good to have them knocked out now. This is the point where we want a balance between sensitivity to pick up what's true and alert on some other things, and overall accuracy. We don't want 90% of our findings to be false positives, because then our development team is either going to spend their entire time just fixing or investigating things which aren't there, or they're going to decide that security is just wasting their time and ignore everything that we send them in future. And I've seen both of those scenarios, that neither of them are good. Well, you get to deployment. Now, deployment is the GP has referred us probably to a specialist. We're now in a bed somewhere under monitoring, being watched carefully. Remediation costs are high because we can't simply go back and redevelop. We have to patch, we have to go through the full change control process. And even if you're working in a lean way, it's still something you want to avoid doing. The one advantage is identifying true positives is much, much easier than it was before. We can say whether a vulnerability is present simply by running an exploit against it. We can say, yes, it's there. We know it's there. We've got exploitation of it. Our lovely pen testers have given us this finding and we've verified it. So we at least can say, well, we're probably not going to be getting any false positives out of this, because we can check them much more easily. But if we do get false positives, they are very expensive to fix. They take a long time. They involve a step back. It's not good. False negatives are what we really, really want to avoid at this point, however, because any false negatives here go into production. Anything we've missed at this stage goes into production, and in production, we're no longer talking to doctors. We can't really do preventative measures anymore. So while great, we can identify true positives, although if we're talking about production as security monitoring rather than scanning of vulnerabilities, true positives do get a bit more challenging. We can identify them, but they're very bad news. And if we have a false positive, it can have a huge impact on our system. It could be turning off the database because there was some suspicious traffic. And if that's a false positive, it's going to kick back. So yeah, false positives are potentially disastrous. They could impact the core business, the core of what we try and do. Meanwhile, false negatives are also pretty disastrous, because a false negative means we've been breached. We've got an ongoing issue and we've not picked it up. So for this point, we want as few false positives and negatives as possible. We want to avoid false positives if we can, but false negatives are the ones we absolutely have to avoid. So if testing, let's say, a SOC or any sort of automated machine learning system designed to pick up anomalous traffic or attempted exploitation, it's very important to actually get an idea of what the false positives will be and the false negatives. And you can do that using a confusion matrix. You can run it against various tests of systems that you understand fully and get an idea of how it will work on a genuine but unknown system, one where you've not had the time or not had the capability to stack it all out entirely, or where it changes and shifts too quickly to do that accurately. And these are not absolutely permanent, perfect measures. These are variable, they are flexible, but they are a guide to how effective particular tooling is. And with that, you can get an idea of which tools you should be looking at each point in development, deployment, and production lifecycle. So, just to recap, and I've run a little short, but there's plenty of other stuff going on in a little while, and you can always grab a cup of coffee if there aren't many questions to fill the gap. Recap. Security assessment and monitoring is something we can measure. We can measure the quality of it. These are tried and tested methods to give us ways to assess the accuracy of tests. These are methods that are used in life-saving work. These are methods that will actually be being used at the moment for tests to determine whether they are worth rolling out or not. So if it's a good enough method to apply to saving lives, it's probably good enough for security, where most of the time we're not looking to do that. And the measurement, other than getting that initial sample, doesn't require a lot of work. It's quite easy. If you've got that sample, if you've run the tests over it, the maths is simple. You can get the numbers out. And once you've got the numbers out, you know which measure is important at each stage of the life cycle. You're going to be using different tools at different stages anyway. So you're going to be using threat modeling early on. You can use it later. It's not as useful because you've already missed most of your threats early, and now you're just getting a long list of stuff you should have fixed. You can use vulnerability scanning at various points in the life cycle, and you will be using monitoring and assessment. Hopefully you will be using it with a SOC or at least some sort of monitoring and alerting system towards the end. So we know which aspects matter most at each stage of that life cycle. All right. I hope you've enjoyed this. If there are questions, then I think Stu's asking for them now. Do donate to the IsolationCon fundraiser for Doctors Without Borders, and get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you, James. Awesome stuff. Yeah, any questions on Twitch, just fire them over. We've got a bit of time. Yeah, I'm personally, James, I mean, I find the whole metrics thing within security actually very difficult, because it's knowing what's valuable and who are they valuable to. Especially as you start to feed things further up the chain, it becomes less about, well, you have to be careful with a lot of metrics, because they can be perceived in a certain way that's very different to what a security team would value them as.
Yeah, it's I mean, that's the reason I stole this methodology from medical, because they deal with the same issues around metrics, and it does work on testing systems.
Anybody else for Q&A while we've got James here? Just a reminder, I think all the talks will be, oh, there we go. Yep, how do you approach the challenge of discrepancies between tool categorization or rating?
Ground truth. take a ground truth and say, this is the thing I'm testing against, no matter what the tool. So you might want a different one at different life cycle stages. So you might want if you're looking more at, we want to assess pen testers or a pen testing tool, you'll be looking more at a capture the flag type scenario where you've built a system deliberately vulnerable. If you're looking earlier on, you could even take something like the OWASP top 10 and say, that's our ground truth. We will put some of these into the design and then test all of our tools against this defined and known sample. Other than that, the problem is discrepancies will always happen. But if you've got a good sample that you are willing to say, I will not question it, you can assess any tool that can be applied to that sample in the same way. If that makes sense, which hopefully it does. Let me know if it doesn't, and I'll try to rephrase.
Good. In medicine, ground truth is highly questionable, but doctors are gods. Who are the gods of cybersecurity ground truth? That's a whole talk in itself, isn't it?
It depends on the stage in the life cycle. So at the beginning, when you're at design, usually there aren't any, or at least a lot of places I've worked, there aren't any. Some places, they do bring in security people to look at design and architecture, in which case the gods of cybersecurity ground truth at that stage are those security architects who are doing threat modeling and assessing against it. Later on, usually the gods of ground truth are your assessment tools, which is where a problem comes in. Really what you need is people to double check those assessments to get a ground truth. You can't just rely on a tool, because there will be false positives, there will be false negatives. You will still have those if you have people check them over, but you reduce the number and then you can take that as your truth to assess other tools.
Yep, cool. Any more on Twitch?
I think there's one being typed out by the looks of it. Okay.
There's a known problem if you allow ground truth to be varied during the process. In medicine, that's a real issue. How might one prevent that in cyber?
You simply don't allow it to be varied. Depending on where you are, you could say, okay, we've discovered our ground truth was fundamentally wrong. We'll start the assessment over. Otherwise, you're not dealing with people having their lives at risk, and any assessment that you do is going to be better than the metrics we have at the moment for these sorts of tools, which are largely, yes, we promise our tool is the best one you'll find. Best in market, best in breed, we've been around for longest. Right, okay, so this is
here for those who can't see it. So what about normalizing to measure uncertainty across the sum total of the life cycle with tools reporting different ratings or even categories?
Yep, I was thinking about talking more about the uncertainty and about weighting of ground truth and how you could work with that. Then I realized that I want to save that for if I ever go back to university to go for my doctorate, because we're then getting away from a simplistic measure which gives us a number into Fisher probabilities. I can see ways it could work, because you could weight your ground truth and bring that into the weighting of your results and how you get a rating at the end. But it's going to be, let's say, a headache to work out all of the maths behind that, and I would need a refresher course from someone in mathematics to start with. So hopefully that answers the question as best I can. If anyone wants to fund me for a PhD into measuring uncertainty in different cybersecurity tools across the sum total of the development life cycle, I'm more than happy to talk to you, because frankly, it sounds fascinating and really useful.
Was it coffee fueled?
Yeah, with the underscore. Someone else stole the actual one and hasn't used it in about 8 years.
I assume Chris is a family member, or have we just
He
been
is,
very
yes.
fortunate to have two
No,
people?
no, he's a family member, and he's the one who actually set me off on this track, because he worked in medical technology and started the whole conversation about using confusion matrices for assessment of tests.
Awesome. Cool. Listen, James, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who's been on this channel, or if you've dipped in and out. I think what's going to happen now is we're going to move on to the first channel, the main channel. I think it's the red one. There's going to be a pub quiz, I believe, and then a bit of an after party. So yeah, look, thanks everyone who's contributed, who's put money to this, who's watched the talks. Well, sneaked in a question at the end there. Does money get in the way, and what do you think of Douglas Hubbard?
Do you mean in the way of doing the remediation, or do you mean in the way in another way?
Well, we don't know. We'll wrap there, James.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you very much indeed. Just to echo Stu's point about what a great bunch we've had in the blue track today. It's been really fascinating stuff. Really enjoyed having your company, and thank you for taking the time out. And yeah, to everybody that's given money to the cause, awesome. We love you very much. So thank you. Cheers.